Absolutely. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So we turn now to our second week of discussing the entire vision based upon self-construction. We began last week, of course, with a study of Nietzsche and Emerson. We will turn this week to a discussion of Romanticism, and then continue next week with a discussion of hope. And then, as we noted, we're reversing those weeks. Yes, hope in Christianity. And then we'll look at sort of a side issue that these ideas have been taken in more recent times, and then conclude after that. So we have several weeks where we'll really be able to go into depth about these issues. And as we mentioned in the email, today's class will be structured first around an open discussion of the issues Professor Unger raised right at the tail end of the class, and then we will turn from that discussion to a shift to Romanticism. We will allow the discussion to take the time it needs. We have several weeks, so we will use this week and the upcoming ones to really explore this entire set of themes in depth. To begin the discussion,
so
let
Michael,
me start off. Oh yeah, please.
To that, just a proposal that we proceed in this class in 3 steps. So the first step would be to return to the general characterization of this project, its defects, and its revision. Then the second step is its philosophical and political background. And then the third step would be Romanticism.
That sounds wonderful.
And I think we should take as long as we need.
Indeed.
Without rushing.
Indeed, indeed. So let me kick off the first part of this by asking you a couple of questions based upon your discussion of last week. Then feel free in your response to use the occasion to return to a lot of those key themes, and then we will open it up for a discussion. So to begin with a couple of very quick questions. We were discussing last week how this vision of the radical, unfettered will of the individual self was being used by Emerson and Nietzsche as the basis by which to throw off our dangers as human beings. Our dangers, as we discussed, was a tendency to become simply habitual creatures, defined entirely by the context into which we happen to be born and happen to be living, failing, therefore, to actually pose any question that would allow us to alter that world around us, leading ultimately, in at least the vision of Nietzsche, to ultimately a sense of nihilism, because we would never be actually constructing values that we would be living by, but rather de facto simply living life according to the world given to us. And we discussed how in both cases, the goal was to look at the self, again, the unfettered will of the self, as that which would liberate us from the dangers we just mentioned. And we also noted, and this of course is why we wanted to begin our discussion with these two, the potential dangers of such an approach, because it's only by dealing with those dangers can we actually, hopefully, deal with the full philosophical implications of this approach. And among those dangers, as we noted, was by focusing explicitly on the radical self with the radical unfettered will, do you potentially leave, well, key issues unasked, namely, what is the self and what is the will? And also, do you potentially undercut from your own project the bases by which you could hopefully construct a better world? And these, of course, were the issues that Professor Unger was touching on in the tail end. And so let me then pose these as questions to you, Professor Unger. So given the visions we were looking at last week, and I'll use Nietzsche as sort of the most extreme of these examples, so therefore a good basis on which to pose the questions, is there not a danger in this approach by saying, I will focus on the radical unfettered will, that we will, number one, undercut from ourselves the potentials to create a better world, because what that creates is a endless battle of the self constantly trying to liberate itself from the world around one, an endless, to touch on a lot of the themes we'll be discussing more in detail this week, an endless revolt against the context that one happens to be living within, as opposed to posing the questions of how one, on the contrary, could be altering that context, such that we and all of us could therefore flourish. That leads directly, that final sentence, to a second question. Is there not a danger by beginning with the self as your starting point and really ending there, seeing that as your ultimate project? Is there not a danger because, needless to say, from another perspective that we'll be looking at later in the semester, a counter-argument to this would be, well, what we are as human beings depends entirely on the relationships that we build. Usually, the danger is that we do not do that actively, which is why we fall into such incredibly dangerous worlds for ourselves and those around us. But the goal, to therefore create a better world, is to ask, how would we create worlds where we, as humans, collectively, could begin to flourish? And once one poses that question, one of your goals is to undercut the vision of the self as the focus of your project, because at least from this perspective, that will always lead into dangers of egotism, narcissism, a failure to actually see the world around one as something that needs to be changed, except insofar as it helps oneself to be liberated. And then continuing along these, a third question, even the notion of a unitary self perhaps should be questioned. Again, looking at the philosophies we'll be looking at later this semester, they will say very explicitly, well, the whole notion of a unitary self is itself a construct, and as with any construct, we should question whether it's a good one. And we will look at philosophers later that will say the self is multiple, and what we become over time depends, sadly, on the context into which we're born. We passively construct a world, but if one wants to actively construct a world, again, you're doing so, as mentioned before, in terms of your relationships with everyone else and building a world where we can flourish. You're also doing it assuming that what we could become, therefore, is multiple, because we are multiple selves. And what sorts of a world we build, what sorts of relationships we build, what directions we take in our lives is part of the world that we're constructing. And if you begin by assuming there's a unitary self that needs to be liberated, aren't you, ironically, at the beginning point, limiting, and even perhaps dramatically limiting, our potential of what we could become, because you always start with this pre-given self that you think you already have, and therefore potentially dramatically limit both, as in the earlier questions, your ability to create a better world for those around us, and, ironically, even limiting what we're potentially capable of becoming. So let me just pose those as opening questions, and feel free to take off from there.
So let me take those questions in the reverse order in which you pose them, and then use my comment as a ramp back into last week's general discussion before we open up for conversation. So first, the unitary self. My understanding is that the idea of the unitary self, as it is presented by these philosophers of the project of nonconformity and self-invention, is less an assumption than it is an agenda. That is, they say that we are to emancipate ourselves, we are to become free, we are to come into the possession of life by constructing a unitary self. Mm-hmm. It's not what we begin with, it's what we want to end up with. But nevertheless, there is the question of whether this is what we should want to end up with. Mm-hmm. Because they may underestimate the complication, the ambiguity, and the ambivalence of the rigidified self that we build around us as we grow older. So the Greeks said, the ancient Greeks, that character is destiny. But one could think that what happens characteristically as we grow older is that there begins to form around each of us a carapace, a shell. You might call it a mummy, which is the combination of the automatisms of the self, its habitual form of life, with the circumstance to which it resigns itself. We begin to think we could live many lives, but this is, in the end, the only life that we're really going to live. And then in this mummy, the rigidified form of the self, each of us begins to die. And that would then be the negation of the very objective of these philosophers, which is the reaffirmation of our vitality, that we not die before we ultimately die. Now, coming back to your second question about the relation to others. If we compare this with Christianity, which is one of the origins of these ideas, historically, one of the great inspirations of this project, we are struck by the following. In Christianity, there is the theme of infinity, of transcendence, the self made in the image of God, sharing the divine attribute of transcendence. But there's also the other theme, the theme of love as the organizing principle of the moral life. And the whole genius of this religious and moral vision lies in the relation between these two themes. Now, it seems, to make a long story very short, that what is happening in this interpretation of the project, if not in the project itself, is the complete sacrifice or subordination of the second theme, the love theme, to the first theme, the infinity theme. And that may be a radical misrepresentation of who we really are or have reason to become. Now we go back then to the first theme, politics. Indeed, in this statement of the project by these two canonical philosophers, Emerson and Nietzsche, there is lacking a political horizon. And by default, the political horizon is a crude idea, much more explicit in Nietzsche than in Emerson, which is the strong self above the weak herd. And this seems to be a fatal flaw in this statement of the views. It lacks a politics. And the politics that it seems to have by reason of not having an explicit one is a politics that we have every reason to reject. So it's important to remember that the statement of this project by these philosophers is not the only statement. There's also the statement by the liberal political philosophers like Mill and Herzen and Tocqueville, who were universally concerned with the danger that democracy would result in a universalization of conformity into a society of sheep. More equal, but less great. And then thus intensely anxious over the question of how our self-possession, our empowerment, our ascent to greatness, to transcendence, could be sustained and enhanced under democracy. But even they, these liberal political thinkers, although they expressed this concern, almost entirely lacked a political answer to it. They expressed it as a danger of democracy, but they didn't translate their apprehension into a program. And that's what we would need to correct this defect. That is, we would have to understand this vision as calling for a politics of deep freedom, in which the true objective of the progressives is not simply or chiefly to obtain an equalization of outcome or of circumstance, but rather a shared greatness. Under what conditions can we become big together? And that then requires a series of changes in our economic and political institutions, and in our form of education, and in the endowments, the rights and capabilities that are settled on each individual. So that then is the introduction to a long discussion. That is, as it were, the missing politics of this project.
Yes.
Now, having stated those three answers, I want to take some minutes to go back to my outline at the end of class last week and restate the points so that they are clearer in our minds before we return to the discussion. So first, what is the essence, what is the core of this vision, especially as it is stated by these philosophers, Emerson and Nietzsche? It has the following elements. The first is this idea that the individual is the vehicle, the repository of an immense force that comes from outside. Vitality. And Nietzsche calls it power. Emerson invokes it as a divine force present in the individual. Distinct from the second project that we're going to examine, which I call the project of responsibility and solidarity, where what is sacred, the source of energy, lies in the logic of interpersonal relations. Here, it's as if the force comes from outside. It's, as it were, diffuse in the world, in the cosmos, but flows through us, through the individual. And this is what we experience as life. And then what we want is to possess it, so long as we are physically alive, to possess it fully, to come into the possession of it, rather than to squander it. And what then in this vision is our enemy? What is it that threatens this flowing of the force of the vitality into the individual? It's the dead hand of routine, of repetition, of habit, of convention, of conformity. And this is a remarkably persistent theme throughout this tradition. So, for example, you can find it in a mid-20th century philosopher like Heidegger. That's the enemy. The enemy is this impersonal stuff of society. And what then is the antidote to this threat that comes from society? It is an endless struggle, a struggle against convention, against habit, and in the end, against the order of society and of culture. So Nietzsche, for example, says, the life of every great man should be called not so-and-so and his time, but so-and-so and his struggle against his time. That's the idea of human greatness. And that then leads to the question of who can hope to possess it? Are we to imagine that this is the possession of a lucky few, or is it a universal possession? That's the question of the political horizon. So Nietzsche explicitly seems to suggest that it's reserved to a few. But we can't really attribute this idea to Emerson, because Emerson, in his theological ideas, insisted on the presence of the divine, of the prophetic power within everyone. And indeed, he was dismissed from the Harvard Divinity School because he insisted on that idea. Now, then, what are the essential defects in this tradition? Placing your three questions now in a larger context. So, the first couple of defects have to do with the misrepresentation of the conditions under which we can become free and come into the possession of life. The first condition, your second question, or your first question, has to do with our relation to the others. The others are indeed a threat. Hell, as Jean-Paul Sartre said. The others are hell. But the others are also the condition of salvation. And we cannot become free except through connection with them. Only connect. But every connection is a threat. And thus, all our relations to the others are infected or tainted with an ineradicable ambivalence. So how can we connect to become free without paying for the connection the price of the loss of distinction and of autonomy? Now, then the second condition of our freedom of self-possession is that we be able to engage in a real world. No one is free in isolation. The isolated genius, marginalized. No one chooses isolation voluntarily because everyone knows that isolation is a form of enslavement, of disempowerment. But if we engage in a particular world, it seems that we have to pay for our engagement the price of our surrender to that world. How is it that we can engage in a world not allowing that world to have the last word, but keeping the last word for ourselves? How is it that we can engage without surrendering? And it seems that the answer to that question depends in part on politics, how we organize society, but it also depends on us, how we arrange our lives, how we orient the conduct of life. So that we insist on never being just insiders, but also outsiders. And we somehow compensate in the conduct of life for the deficiencies of society. That then leads to the third defect, which is the absence of a politics, what I just call the politics of deep freedom. Missing in these canonical statements of this project, and missing even in the classical liberal thinkers, because they did have a structural program, but their structural program was a dogma, classical 19th century liberalism. And it seems that what we require is not a one-time dogmatic blueprint as they proposed, but a continuing process, which in our historical circumstance would lead to new economic and political institutions, to a new form of education, to a new way of being, socially as well as personally. The fourth defect is the one that last week I called Prometheanism. So there is in this version of the ideas a denial of our neediness, of our vulnerability, of our weakness, and in particular of our mortality, our groundlessness, and our insatiability. As if we gave in to the temptation of a self-deification. It's one thing to become more godlike by seeking transcendence. And it's another thing to try and become more godlike by pretending that we can approach the divine attributes of omniscience and omnipotence. So you know the ancient Romans had the following practice. After one of their leaders or victors won in war, there was a triumphal procession in the Roman Forum. and the Triumphator rode in his chariot, surrounded by the cheering crowd. But he had in his chariot a slave, and the slave every few moments whispered into his ear, "Memento mori," remember that you will die. This is the idea of the antidote to Prometheanism that calls us back to our real situation and has a series of practical implications, reminding each of us that no one saves himself, and that the price of our ascent is a heightening of the level of accepted vulnerability, not the raising of a shield. We have to throw down the shield in order to transform ourselves and to live. And then the fifth defect in this tradition is the defect of its emptiness. So we become freer, we become great, and then what? What do we do with our time? So what seems to be denied in this statement of the project is that the substance of our freedom arises from our engagements, our tasks on the one hand, and from our attachments, our connections, our devotions, our loyalties, our loves on the other hand. So Sigmund Freud summarized it when he said, what makes people happy is what make people happy are work and love. And that's the content. So we can't have a view of this self-construction that empties it out of what gives it substance. And this substance arises in particular domains. And that's the only possible answer to this danger of emptiness. Now, finally, imagine that we revise this project to give some kind of answer to each of these 5 defects that I've just enumerated. Would it somehow merge into the other projects, and in particular into the other major project that we'll discuss later in the course, this project of responsibility and solidarity? I don't think so. I think that even if we succeeded, or to the extent that we succeed in correcting these defects, it would still have distinctions. So let's just recall them, because reminding ourselves of these distinctions makes us understand what is central to this project. So the first distinction is, as you suggested in your remarks at the outset, adopting the perspective of the agent. It's not self-evident, because the other project adopts, I think, not the perspective of society as a unified entity, but the perspective of what we could call joint intentionality. It sees as central the interpersonal, neither the individual nor society, but what happens among us. That's what's central. And it's from that what's most important results, and that we can expect our ascent. But here the idea, even in a revised version of the project, is that in the end, what each of us has is us individually. And then comes the struggle to connect, to engage, but starting from the reality of the embodied self, embodied in a mortal body. The second distinctive element, which would remain at the end of the day, is this idea of the radical transcendence of the self, of its infinity. That there's always more in us than there is in these worlds that we inhabit. We spill over them. There is a surfeit, an excess, which we can turn into transgression. And that too remains at the end of the day. And then, third, even in the revised version of this project, there is this idea of the imperative of struggle, of negation, what Hegel calls the endless labor of negation, of all the particular forms of society and culture. We have no home in the world. There's no context that we can ultimately accept and come to rest. Hegel, by the way, didn't believe that, because he did believe that at the end there was a final overcoming of contradiction. And that's why we can't take him as a representative of this point of view. And then, finally, there is the moral privilege given to disruption and to the disruptive personality. As I said last week, this idea that the disruptors, the rebels, are the spiritual aristocracy of the human race. And then the question is, how much of humanity can participate in this form of experience? The Spanish philosopher Miguel de Unamuno states this idea in another form. Less elitist than Nietzsche's form, and explicitly connects it with Christianity. When he says, in the world, the victors are those who adapt to the world, and the defeated are those who demand that the world adapt to them. And then Unamuno continues, and therefore, the advance of humanity rests entirely upon the shoulders of the defeated. And he ends by saying, Christianity is the religion of the defeated. The religion of the defeated, not the religion of the resentful, as Nietzsche thought. Now here's a final thought then, before we open up for discussion. Related to what we're going to discuss in the third part of the class about Romanticism. There is a historical process. So these projects that we're discussing take place in history. There is a historical process of moral discovery and of the political reconstruction of society. And this historical process takes place in historical time. But we don't live in historical time. We live in this very short lifespan in some arbitrary moment of this historical process. So St. Augustine says, every age is equidistant from eternity. But if we think historically, we can't fully believe that. Because at different moments of this historical process, we're in a different situation. And we don't get to choose. So it has been said that the most important advice you could follow is to choose your parents very wisely. And so I say, well, we'll choose our historical period, but we can't. And so then it seems that part of the problem in the discussion the program of the conduct of life is that it has to have as one of its features to compensate for the defects of the historical circumstances. Somehow each of us has to do in his life what society has not yet done in its collective construction. And this introduces a complication that I think almost none of these views that we're discussing, these thinkers, does justice to. But we have to introduce into our conversation. So why don't we open it up for discussion now?
Wonderful. Let's open it up.
Yes.
Professor Unger, when you were discussing Sartre's line, people are hell, do you take that to mean that the concept of bad faith and the opinions of others encroaching on the self is the hell, or is it perhaps something else?
I think you're asking a question what Sartre means, not what I mean, because I don't share this view. It's a one-sided, Sartre's statement is a one-sided statement, a one-sided interpretation of a real problem, one of these two fundamental conditions of emancipation. No one becomes free. No one builds himself. No one becomes bigger except through connection with the others. And it's just practical connection in practical economic life, emotional connection, cognitive connection, language is a common property, and so forth. But every connection is a threat. So the connection is necessary, but the connection is dangerous. That's the basic idea. And therefore, and we all recognize that. And so our relations to one another are always infused by an insuperable ambivalence. Now, what then is the solution to that problem in this point of view? There isn't one solution. So notice that this is totally different from what in the second class we call the school philosophy. Because the school philosophy thinks that the basic problem in the moral life is to discipline selfishness. And the answer is some kind of impersonal altruism or impersonal rules. But here it's a different view. That one of the fundamental problems in the moral life is this complication in our relation to the others. We need them, but we are justifiably afraid of them. And the question is, how can we connect to them without paying the price, or at least by diminishing the price of this danger of loss of distinction, loss of self, loss of freedom? And so one answer to that is, in the intimate sphere, is love. Because that, in this tradition, is a definition of what love is. This mutual recognition and acceptance in which our connection to the other ceases to impose the price of loss of distinction and subjugation. But love doesn't survive outside the intimate sphere. So what is the equivalent to love outside, beyond the intimate sphere? And then we might have the political idea that it's a form of cooperation among free and equal agents. And to the extent that our cooperation approaches that ideal, then we can connect without paying the price of loss of distinction and of freedom. So that's how we begin to think. And that takes us away from the school philosophy, but takes us toward the idea that we can't have a morals without also having a politics. Yes.
So, Professor Unger, you mentioned that enemy is the impersonal stuff of society. And then,
In this tradition, in this view, yes. Yes.
then you proceeded to reference a Spanish philosopher who,
Unamuno, yes.
in this world, victors adapt, whereas losers think that the world should adapt to them.
Yes.
So, in this sense, because when we are adapting, we are kind of giving in the impersonal. We are accepting the impersonal
Yes.
for what it is.
Yes.
Are victors in that sense always the enemy in society?
Well, again, so you asked me about Sartre as if it were my thought, and now you're asking me about Unamuno as if it were my thought. But I don't quite agree with either of them. So I have to say what I think in response to this question. Unamuno's statement is a simplification, as Sartre's was, because it's not that there can be an absolute distinction between the insider and the outsider. According to the view that I defended in my commentary on the flaws of this project, as stated by Emerson and Nietzsche, no one can be free as just an insider or as just an outsider. We can't be free unless we participate in a particular world, but we also can't be free if, when we participate in a particular world, we surrender to it. So we have to participate in it and resist it at the same time. And so Unamuno's simple distinction between the victors who adapt and the defeated who reject is too simple to characterize the real situation. That's what I think. Yes?
Thank you, Professor. To what extent is it accurate to say that one problem with the Nietzschean project especially is that it indeed makes one conventional in a much more dangerous sense than than following any other principle, in that while under ordinary circumstances, for instance, when a man presents a woman with a wedding ring or when a man wears a suit, there may be reasons beyond simply conforming that are...
Hey, can you speak just a little louder,
Oh,
please?
I'm sorry, thank you, Professor. I was saying, to what extent may we say that Nietzsche's fault, or rather, that one of the dangers of Nietzsche's theory is that one becomes conventional in a very new and a very dangerous sense, in that while a proper social convention, the convention, for instance, of kneeling before one's beloved, or presenting the one wants to marry with a wedding ring, there is something higher than simply conforming in that. Whereas when one flaunts societal conventions simply to flaunt them, one simply becomes a conventionalist in that one believes that conventions may only be replaced by, well, one's thought is simply governed by convention, rejection of convention or the introduction of a new convention. And if this first part of the question be correct, then would I be right in ascribing this fault to modern philosophy generally's unjustified abandonment of classical metaphysics?
Of classical which?
Of classical metaphysics, and with it the conception of a highest good that we could perceive. To put this question a bit more simply, as I think Jeeves in the P.G. Wodehouse novel said to Bertie Wooster, you wouldn't like Nietzsche, sir, he's fundamentally unsound. Is this the fundamental
Very English. So let me separate two elements in your remark. Let me postpone the discussion of classical metaphysics, because it actually will come up in what we had planned for the second part of today's class, and deal just with the first element in your remark about convention. So indeed, this treatment of convention is too simple, just like the treatment of the relation to the others or the relation to the context was too simple. And it is related to a defect of romanticism that we're going to come to in the third part of the class, which is this war against everything that is routine or repetition, therefore convention also. And Kierkegaard, who in some ways also related to this tradition, said the war against repetition is a war against life, because repetition penetrates life. So there has to be some more complicated dialectic between repetition and the overcoming of repetition, like in music. So the seductive power of music resides in part in this, that there's an interaction between repetition or consonance and dissonance. And that's what our experience is like. So the innovation acquires its character by its relation to something that remains, that is repeated. So I agree with you with that aspect of your statement. But I think it also touches on a problem of moral psychology, which is, let me try and state it just by, describe it by a literary and a theological allusion. So, the king in Hamlet says, my words fly up, my thoughts remain below. Words without thoughts never to heaven go. So there's this idea that the convention is dead unless it has the element of spirit. And it's spirit that gives authority to the convention. On the other hand, in several religious traditions, there is the following idea. You don't have to believe in order to pray. You pray so that you may believe. And the repetition of the formula then creates a basis that invites belief. Now, so there's a debate about this, and our moral psychology is complicated enough so that both of these propositions, the one stated by the king in Hamlet and the one presumed by these religious traditions, can be true at the same time. So I suppose I'm saying that I agree with you in that the relation to convention is too simple. But that's not the same thing as allowing for there to be an equation, a reduction of spirit to convention. So now, anticipating a theme from the discussion of romanticism. Romanticism is a variant of these beliefs. One of the central problems in the romantic variant of these beliefs is the following notion. Structure, routine, convention is the enemy of spirit. What is spirit? Spirit is a theological word to describe life transcendent over structure. When are we truly human? When are we truly free? Only in those interludes in which we shake the rule of structure. So, the mob in the streets, as opposed to the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. The experience of romantic love, as opposed to the routines of married life. So the romantic idea is that only in those interludes are we free. The structure will always reassert itself. And then we will cease to be free. And we have to rebel against and shake the routines. So that is one aspect of the romantic idea. It is a form of despair. And what it despairs of is the possibility that we might change the relation between structure and spirit. That we might create structures that are less hostile to the spirit. The idea is that the structures are like the hand of Midas. They kill everything that they touch. And we can create a structure that is less inimical to spirit. So if what you're saying is that this romantic idea is false, and false because it is a form of despair that misrepresents our transformative powers, including our powers to change the relation of structure to spirit, then I agree with you. Yes.
So you talked about isolation, as a form.
Again, I have to ask you to speak louder.
Yeah. So you talked about isolation as a form of enslavement and how no one chooses to live that way. But then Emerson said isolation precedes true society. Emerson said isolation must precede true society, and that
Isolation is what?
must precede true society. So, doesn't that suggest that, we live in isolation to, form our individualism, that, helps us, form a sense of self?
Well, let's distinguish two ideas, right? And again, I'm stating my view. I'm not stating their view. So the true idea is that in the construction of the self, there will be a dynamic and an interplay between moments of withdrawal and moments of engagement. So you isolate yourself, you distance yourself, and then you acquire critical powers, you reimagine the situation, but then you come back, you re-engage. So again, it's like you get into the rocket, you try to escape the gravitational field, but then you come back to Earth. And so our empowerment depends on that dynamic. But that's very different from supposing that we can become free only in isolation, only as remonstrants, only as rebels living at the margin. So connecting your observation to the previous one, after all, the idea of the bohemian artist or philosopher living at the margins of society as an outcast is itself a convention, and a convention which is easily naturalized by society. So the outcast is not a threat. The outcast is assimilated. And it's like the hero in the ancient Greek narratives. The hero is outside and practices a form of violence that is unacceptable within society and is then put to the margins and thinks he's special. But he's not so special because he's doing something useful to society that society wants, but society at the same time wants to contain the taint, to limit the contamination by forcing him to the margin. So he thinks that he's a rebel, but he's part of the show in some way. And so that's a form of self-deception on the part of this marginalized hero. And then it's a diversion from this central line of real empowerment, real freedom. Yes?
It seems to me that I've seen people transcend this dichotomy without words like fighting and despair and so forth, and use, first of all, develop a very strong self, but use the convention to then find a way of expressing themselves very artists doing their version of Windmills of Your Mind. And it was a very joyful experience, the quintessential convention, but with their own particularity.
And so what's the implication?
The implication to me is that there's a way of approaching this that doesn't need to feel like there's a friction between protecting yourself and giving into convention, but rather finding a way of there being a flow of using the convention.
That's what we hope for, but easier said than done. So that's part of the object of discussion. How we can, in the vocabulary that I used, how we can engage without surrendering. Yes.
So one challenge you pointed out in the project of self-construction is that we rely on others, not just in an intimate sense, but in a broader social sense, to achieve our own greatness or to aspire to it. And I definitely agree with that. I'm interested to know where then is the role of broader political engagement outside of people who might affect your life and your prospects of greatness. For example, if you had a relatively isolated small community living a kind of utopian society of deep freedom, would you ethically see a need for them to try and intervene in the broader world?
Well, I guess I can't accept your hypothesis because your hypothesis to me seems a fantasy. So it's a fantasy which has been often evoked, especially in the history of political theory, but it's not real. So there's a savage society, for example, of an Indian tribe isolated in the Amazon, and then the doctrine of the anthropologists, the carriers of a heresy within Western civilization, is just leave them alone because they're all free, and these collective identities are the real protagonists in world history. But no real society is like that. There's conflict. And we then face this as a practical political problem. We should respect the collective choice to be more or less assimilated. But the individual young Indian is not just a member of his tribe. He's a citizen of the Republic. And the Republic should stand by him if he wants to turn against the tribe and shatter its idols. And that's what happens in real history. And so that's the complication. And that then reintroduces us to the real world, which is a world in which no one can be free unless he both engages and resists. Now maybe we should go on to the second part, Michael.
Sure, absolutely.
So let me say
Please,
again
please.
something about, before we go on to the discussion of Romanticism, something about the philosophical and political background to this project. It's not just a historical curiosity. It has implications for the content. So first, the philosophical background. What does this project assume about the world? So first, it assumes that there is one real world, and that the things in this world, the individual entities, the kinds of things, the selves, are real. And the most important thing about the universe is that it is what it is, rather than something else. Second, it assumes that time is real. This is a view in which human life is sunk in time, in temporality. Nothing is more real than time. The physicist Feynman said, jokingly, that time is what is left when everything else leaves. So time is change. Everything changes, including change itself changes, the way in which things change. There is, in this view, nothing that is immutable. Third, this view assumes that history is open. It has no script. And history is open in a world, a natural world, in which novelty is possible. Now, real novelty. What I mean by real novelty is that when something happens in the world, it's not as if it were selected from some antecedent list of possible states of affairs that were just waiting off stage for their cue to come onto the stage. There is an emergence of something that didn't exist before. And our conception of what is possible changes retrospectively in the light of real novelty. And novelty can be accentuated by inflections in the history of the world, like first the emergence of life, then the emergence of consciousness, and then the emergence of culture. A fourth assumption is that the self, the individual self, embodied, has indefinite, unlimited depth. And because of this depth, we are obscure to one another and even to ourselves. And the fifth assumption is the assumption that we could use Nietzsche's phrase of the transvaluation of values to describe. In this view, the ordinary experience, ordinary people have more potential than the noble. And all the standard hierarchies of value are challenged and undermined. Now, those are the assumptions. And the question is this: on what general view of the world, on the basis of what philosophical tradition or framework, do these assumptions make sense? And here we have a remarkable problem that arises in the history of philosophy. There are two major traditions in the world history of philosophy, and neither of them seems to be an adequate basis for these assumptions. The assumptions made by this project of self-invention and inconformity. The first tradition is the tradition of classical metaphysics, or the Greek philosophy of being, which in some fundamental respect is continued in the tradition of modern science, and especially of fundamental physics from Newton to quantum mechanics. So the idea in this tradition, in this philosophical tradition, is that there is a basic structure of the world, a set of fundamental constituents of the world, an ultimate typology of being on one side, and a set of permanent regularities, which modern science describes as the laws, symmetries, and constants of nature. In the tradition of modern science, these are, for example, the basic structure of nature as described by the standard model of particle physics, or at a more superficial level, the periodic table in chemistry. And then there's change, but change within this unchanging framework. So time is real, but not too real. Because what is most real in the world is exempt from time. What is most real in the world is this structure of basic constituents and permanent regularities. That's what we find in this whole tradition from Aristotle to contemporary physics. The association of reality with timelessness. There's a hierarchy of reality, and the more real something is, the less time-bound it is. Now then, there's a second tradition, which is the tradition of, we can sometimes call it speculative monism, fusion with the absolute, most radically represented in some of the philosophies of ancient India, and in the West by the philosophy of Schopenhauer, and to a lesser extent by a philosopher like Spinoza. So there the idea is that the distinctions among things and the changes that appear to happen among things are either not real, they are illusory or epiphenomenal, or they are less real in the qualified versions of this idea. And what is ultimately real is just one being, unitary being, which is timeless. And everything else is either unreal, an illusion, or less real. So this is a contrary tradition in Western philosophy, from Plato to Spinoza and Schopenhauer, but a dominant tradition in other worlds, like ancient India. Now, once again, in this second tradition, we associate reality with timelessness. But neither of these two traditions can be an adequate basis for the assumptions that I described. They would require a third view. The third view might seem to you to be the most self-evident one. The third view is that everything real is mutable. The things the differences among that exist in the world are real differences, but they're not for keeps, because everything changes sooner or later. Even what seem to be the basic constituents of nature and the laws, constants and symmetries of nature. There's nothing permanent. And we now have an empirical basis for this idea in the discovery of the historical character of the universe. We know for a fact that there was a time in the history of the universe when the elements of the periodic table did not exist, and a time in which these regularities of nature did not hold. Now, what's interesting is that this third view is the one that speaks with the weakest voice in the world history of philosophy. There is no consolidated tradition that would articulate this view philosophically. And this has consequences, because then this view, the philosophies of this view, like Emerson and Nietzsche, seem to be floating in a void. They seem to have no basis in an understanding of the world. And that problem is aggravated by another feature, which is that the history of modern Western philosophy can be written in large part as the history of a series of dualisms, of divisions. In the late Middle Ages, the division between the world of nature and the world of grace. Then in Descartes, the division between material things, stuff in space, and mental things. Then in Kant, the division between reality in itself, which we can't have access to, and the presuppositions of our experience. And then in 19th and 20th century historicism, the division between the worlds of history and society and the world of nature. Now, the universal characteristic of these successive dualisms is that our experience is seen as some kind of miraculous exception to the way things are in the world. And so it's as if we reckoned with the lack of a basis, the incompatibility of these ideas with our view of how nature works, what the world is like. It's how we reckon with this by making an exception for ourselves. We're different. Which is a kind of philosophical sleight of hand. And so this is then the connection between the development of these projects and the general question of the way things are. For projects like this, not to seem that they were like wishful thinking, like a form of self-deception, they would have to have a grounding in our understanding of the way the world is. And it seems that they don't. Now, just as a briefer word about the political background. It would be impossible to understand this project of self-invention and nonconformity outside of a very particular history. And the history is the history of a radicalization initially in the Western societies and then in the whole world of economic, social, and political pluralism. So a characteristic formula of many societies in the past has been what you could call the sentimentalization of unequal exchange. So there's a grammar of social relations between men and women, between rulers and ruled, between superiors and underlings, in which the nature of the relation combines three elements. There's power. The relation is asymmetrical. There is an exchange of benefits. And then this unequal exchange becomes the template of a form of allegiance or loyalty. It comes to bear an emotional weight. And we could call that the sentimentalization of unequal exchange, which has been a widespread element in the history of the whole world. These beliefs depend on the breakdown of that sentimentalization of unequal exchange. It's against that political background that they emerge. And then in the last 2 or 3 centuries, they take a very particular form. What I call this revolutionary project that has put the world on fire. It has these two sides. So it has the political side of the doctrines of liberalism, socialism, democracy, and it has the personalist side of the worldwide popular romantic culture, which we're going to discuss later. And so this moral project that we're discussing is related to that. It's one of the voices of that revolutionary program in the world. And the problem is that the votaries of that program, its adepts, no longer know what its next steps should be. So that's why we're here, discussing all this. What are the next steps? So it continues to command the agenda. All the other projects in the world react against it. So in that sense, it's strong, but it's weak because it seems to be disoriented. So that's what I wanted to say by way of political background. And the discussion that we had before about this project lacking a politics is then part of that confusion. Would you like
Great.
to read us something? Yes.
Yeah, should we open this up for
Yes.
comments and questions before we turn to Romanticism in particular? And there's one hand we didn't get a chance to recognize before. If you'd like to jump in at this stage, please feel free to. Yes.
Well, this is, I guess, kind of,
Louder, please.
this is, I suppose, kind of in the vein of romanticism, but I guess
Oh, that's fine.
in the readings of Hegel and of Emerson, I was kind of confused into the conception of the self. It seems the reinterpreted either as like some duality, right, where there's a human spirit and then also a conscious self that suppresses it, almost in like a Freudian sense. But there's also, I suppose, the possibility of suppression is external and structural. And I guess I was kind of confused as to which one of those these thinkers are leaning towards in their writings.
I just didn't hear that. Can you restate
Oh, sure, absolutely. So the question was, and it does indeed, but give us a nice segue into Romanticism, that this fundamental structure of Romanticism that we all already saw a little bit of last week is the concern is a dialectic between spirit and structure and how the relationship between those ultimately works out.
And then what's the question?
Like whether that structure is a conscious self that's suppressing the spirit, or if it's purely external and there's not like a conscious oppression, but rather a falling into external habit, if that makes sense.
Well, my understanding is that in Romanticism, the structure is the enemy of spirit. That they're two opposites. We criticize that view, but that is the core Romantic view, that consciousness affirms itself by opposition to structure. If structure is institution, routine, repetition, apparatus, then that is the death of spirit. That's the Romantic idea. And the way in which consciousness affirms itself is in the war against that. So, Romanticism is unable to imagine spirit living in structure. So, take a very simple feature of the early Romantic novel. So, the major theme of the plot is the hero in search of his true love. And dealing with a series of obstacles to the consummation of the love. And finally, at the end of the novel, the hero gets his beloved and is married. And there's nothing in the novel about the marriage. The marriage is unimaginable because the marriage is the real world of routine, of repetition. So it's as if the whole object of the exercise were projected beyond the horizon. And so this already is a sign that something is wrong with this view. There's a fundamental misunderstanding of who we are and of the relation between consciousness and structure.
Please, yes.
Kind of on that vein, I'm wondering if, say, so if the only sort of ultimate freedom is deterrent from structure, there is arguably structure in everything, in the body, in
Yes.
thought, in day, and so the only thing truly without structure would be the unknown. And kind of from a Christian tradition, the unknown is seen as heaven or the afterlife, and that would
Correct.
be the full realization of the spirit.
Correct.
And so I could sort of see how that would be
Yes.
in that vein of thought
Yes.
realized, but I do think it's worth
But the radical romantic idea, as I was interpreting it earlier, and we're going to discuss next at greater depth, is that this moment of authenticity in which we're fully alive is an inherently transient moment. So it's not as if these romantics were denying your proposition. They're saying, yes, structure will reassert itself. There is no life without structure. But in that structure, we cease to be fully alive. And we're alive in this moment of negation. So it's like to say, there'll be the Cultural Revolution in China, and things will heat up, the volcano will erupt, and then we know that the structure will come back. But in that moment, society will be at a higher level. It's an interlude, doomed to be ephemeral for that very reason. And so what's missing? What's missing is then the sense that it's not just one structure after another in society, but that we can change the character of structure, not simply its content. We can change the way in which a structure is just there. Now, this may seem very abstract, so let me go one step down to give this idea more political content, since we're saying that what's missing, one of the things missing in this tradition is a politics. So what are these structures in society? One way of thinking about them is that they're a kind of frozen fighting. So there's continuous practical and visionary conflict over the organization of society. And this conflict is temporarily interrupted and relatively contained. And it's like a game of musical chairs. The music stops and everyone sits down. And the chairs are the structures, which are the result of the interruption of the struggle. So it's the structures of society are not like part of the furniture of the universe. They're not like the atomic structure of a physical thing. The structures of society are just us. We invented them. But then, to the extent that the conflict stops or is contained, they may appear to us as if they were an alien fate, and as if they were just natural. So we naturalize them. So then comes the romantic and says, that's against us because we're freedom, forgetting that those structures are just the frozen form of us. So then the question is, to what extent can we change the nature of these structures so that they're not just there as if they were natural objects, but are organized to lend themselves to challenge and revision? So another way of stating that idea is, imagine that there are two basic categories of activities that we have. There are the ordinary moves that we make within a framework of assumptions and arrangements that we take for granted, the framework of the structures. And then there are the exceptional moves by which from time to time we challenge and change pieces of this framework, typically under the provocation of crisis. So the romantic assumption, which corresponds with a conservative assumption, is that the relation between these two categories of moves, the structure respecting moves and the structure changing moves, is fixed. But it's not fixed. And we could create structures that bring these two moves closer together so that the transformation of the structures arises more continuously out of our normal activity. We don't have to just treat them on a take it or leave it basis. Then we're freer. And then we can create structures which are more appropriate settings for the spirit. That's the anti-romantic idea, which is a form of hope.
Yes, Professor, I'd like to defend Nietzsche a bit from perhaps the criticism of it being floatiness. And I specifically cite Thus Spake Zarathustra, where Zarathustra bemoans the fact that in the eternal length of time, that there's so much infinite more time of non-advancement, of non-Übermensch, of slave morality, so to speak, but finds a sort of solace in these moments of change where there is a positive movement. Could we not see this as him trying to say that it is not the long-standing political times that is the morality of, say, Nietzsche, but rather the moments of revolution where one, by having that revolting moment, has the master morality and therefore the Übermensch, as opposed to, say, simply creating a new, simply the new society itself.
Yes, but he has no description of a society. All the moments described are moments lived in the individual consciousness and lived by opposition to the collective. So far as I know, there isn't in Nietzsche's thought or writing any description of a transformation of the character of the collective. Collective is the enemy. Now, I think that there's something that should be added to this and that was missing from my account of the political background of this project of self-invention and nonconformity. When there is this dynamic of pluralism, of conflict that I described, undermining the logic of the sentimentalization of unequal exchange, one of the consequences is to delegitimate and subvert all the intermediate structures of society, all the structures in between the individual and the state. And so there's then no natural template of interaction because there's the individual and then there's the whole collectivity. There's nothing in between that we can rely on. And this may help account for what is an extraordinary characteristic of these ideas, especially in their romantic form, that if you look at them from one perspective, they tend to a hyper-individualism. But if you look at them from the other perspective, they also tend to the deification of the collective, of the nation. So Romanticism, a variant of these ideas, alternates between the extreme individualism and the extreme collectivism or nationalism. So there's this, what is worshipped in the end seems to be ultimately not the individual, but this vitality, and which is the great force in the universe, life. And it can be present in us, in individuals, or it can be present in the nation. So you have a thinker like a 20th century political thinker like Carl Schmitt, and then or Heidegger himself in his political misadventures. And then what is deified is on the one hand, the individual who rebels against the structure, but on the other hand, the whole nation in which he submerges his consciousness. So this suggests a fundamental disturbance of the political imagination. Its failure, its inability to imagine the real structure of a real society and how this structure could be reshaped. And so to come to that project of what I call the politics of deep freedom, you need to begin one step earlier in this recognition of the real conditions of freedom. The relation of the self to the others, the relation of the self to the context. And once you go through that, then you have a richer idea of freedom and empowerment. And that then presents you with the task of imagining a real structure. So, could you do all of that and still have some version of this project? Or would it have turned then into something radically different? That's what's not clear. Michael, why don't you take us to Romanticism?
Absolutely. So let us then indeed turn to Romanticism. It's already come up repeatedly, so what I will do in these comments is be brief, outlining a few key issues with Romanticism, touch briefly on the 3 sets of readings, and then again open things up, and we'll play it by time, and we will probably continue this discussion next week. Absolutely. So we have several weeks on these themes largely.
So next week, Romanticism and Christianity.
Indeed.
Which is part of the genealogy of this tradition, going backward from Romanticism to Christianity. Just a word, I put on the blackboard 2 recommendations of readings of 2 wonderful books. One by Northrop Frye on romance, which is the larger world of Romanticism, and the other by Edmund Wilson, Axel's Castle on Modernism, Literary Modernism, which is, in a way, what late Romance turns into. And these are works about literature, not about philosophy. And that deserves a comment, too. The ideas about human nature and the philosophers are, on the whole, almost preposterous and childlike when compared to the ideas of the writers and the poets, who have the vision of the mind, not as a conceptual performer, but as a repository of secret knowledge gained in the fire of personal encounter. So if we want deeper ideas about human nature, we have to turn away from the philosophers to the poets and the writers. And these are 2 very good introductions to the bearing of imaginative literature on our concerns here.
Wonderful. So a few very quick words. First, and this has come up repeatedly, so I'll be brief, think of Romanticism as the claim that there is a radical force of vitality, of life, of radical creativity, radical innovation that is always going to be stifled and stopped by the world of structure. Usually, although as Roberto Unger has already pointed out, and we'll come back to it in great depth, usually but not only, this vitality is seen as imbued in the great heroic individual. So the great heroic individual is that figure who is radically alive, radically vital, radically innovative, radical creatively, opposed to the world that is structured, repetitious, habitual, and therefore holding him or her, although in this tradition, we'll come back to this, it's mainly a him, back. In the various versions of this that play out in literature, it's the radical romantic hero battling against society, always in the long run failing, but of course the power of the story is that heroic effort, and it's in the battle itself that the focus is being played out in terms of our concern. In other words, the concern in this tradition is not how would we recreate the world such that we could be innovative and creative on a daily, mundane basis. The focus is always the radical, heroic battle against structure, and the point at which that battle ends is the point at which the novel ends and you turn to the next novel. It's the heroic battle that is of interest. Now, with that as a very quick statement, let me say a few words about the readings we've given you and why. To begin with Hegel, this might have struck you as a little odd because, as I'm sure you noticed in the first 2 pages, what Hegel means by classical and what he means by romantic is not what we usually mean. We did this for a very particular purpose because Hegel, part of his brilliance, is Hegel has an extraordinary vision of the ways philosophical ideas play out in the long term. So very quickly, Hegel's move here, as I'm sure you noticed very quickly, by classical, he does not mean 18th century classicism. By romantic, he does not mean 19th century romanticism. By classical, he means antiquity. He means the world, mentioned earlier by Professor Unger, a world in which everything is perfectly structured. The classical form of art, therefore, would be the world in which spirit perfectly matches structure. So think, for example, of, this is his example, I mean, of the perfect Greek statue. The perfect white, we, by the way, know this is wrong, they actually were painted, but nonetheless, in terms of Hegel's time, the perfect white statue, perfectly structured, embodying the heroic spirit. Static, unmoving, perfectly structured. The shift toward the romantic vision is, on the contrary, or coming after that, Christianity. And needless to say, what Hegel is thinking of here is the Christian incarnation. Spirit, the absolute inwardness of God, coming down and joining structure. In the incarnation, of course, that is God coming down and becoming both divine and human in the form of Jesus. And for Hegel, once you have this notion, you have the development of what he is going to call romantic art, which for him is based in this dialectic of spirit, radical inwardness, coming down, entering structure. For Hegel, this creates an inherent dialectic that then he wants to see is playing out over the subsequent millennium. Early on, it means works of art that try to begin to focus on the inward nature of the characters portrayed. So, one of his key examples are those extraordinary paintings of the mother and Jesus, in which the focus is not the perfect structure of the painting, but when it works, the incredible inward feeling given by that moment of incarnation, or at the end, with the death of Jesus. And what he is getting at here is the focus is on the spirit in this structure, but it's the inwardness of the spirit that's trying to pull you in. And then, Hegel wants to argue, the dialectic plays out toward ultimately seeing that friction grow and grow and grow. And the last point of this, and it's an amazing work of brilliance on Hegel's part, because of course he's writing this in the early 19th century, but the last part of this he is seeing as what ultimately plays out when this reaches its radical stage, and it's a perfect summation, of course, of the century to come, even though he doesn't live to see it, and yet it's a perfect summation of it, which for Hegel is the ultimate tension plays out where radical spirit cannot work with structure, and so it creates this endless battle, which, of course, he correctly notes to be what will play out over the course of the 19th century that we now think of as Romanticism, in which that contradiction between the two is absolutely and completely irresolvable. As Roberto has mentioned, or Professor Unger, sorry, as Professor Unger, yes. As he has mentioned, we'll use the general pronoun. The most powerful place where one then sees this is actually not in 19th century philosophy. It's actually in 19th century literature and art and music. And we've given you 2 examples, but we actually just asked you to read the plot summaries because the novels are long. But where you actually see this tension playing out over the course of the 19th century from early Romanticism, which is based upon the great hero striving for something, usually striving for his love object. And as I'll say Roberto Unger, so that mixes the familiar and the, the properly respectful, as Roberto Unger has argued, plays out with either the achievement of the love, but then of course the novel has to end, or the impossibility of the love, which means it results in failure, but of course the excitement of the novel is the quest. In other words, the entire moment, the arc of the novel is based upon this heroic quest battling against the conformity and conventions of society. So he, the great romantic hero, wants something that he cannot have, so it's a love interest, for example, from a different social stratum. He cannot achieve this. He must battle against the world, and whether successful or not, the novel ends at the point at which that battle ends, either because he's failed or he's succeeded, but again, then it must stop because the daily mundane stuff is not of any interest. Playing out toward the more radical versions of this, in which it's always going to be tragic because that endless battle of the romantic hero against the conventions of society is seen as so inherent and so embedded in our nature, if we're going to live up to our vital possibilities, that the novel has to end in tragedy because we can never be content with the horrible structures and conventions of the world. Whether one lives out the early version or the late version, the key, of course, is, again, precisely the dialectic that Hegel is emphasizing. It is that radical dialectic at every step between vital spirit, radical creativity, and endless structure. And it is absolutely unresolvable, which then creates the situation which we have mentioned, where the radical romantic hero is always outside of society, battling against society, battling against the conventions of society, endlessly trying to be radically new and creative, which, as an earlier set of questions have mentioned, becomes, ironically, a convention in itself because it's an endless battle, constantly trying to show that, in fact, you are not a structured creature, which, in fact, becomes the structure that defines you. And then, of course, our third reading is by Roberto Unger himself, in which, in his work Passion, he is trying to make an argument. You're getting a sense of this over this course, but we'll deepen the discussion in the weeks to come, in which he is arguing that actually this entire tradition, as Hegel was correctly noting, coming out of a Christian metaphysics, equally and for the same reason needs to be rethought and developed, because ultimately, if it stays simply within that line of this radical tension between spirit and structure, ultimately, it will never work out into any kind of an attempt to deal with how we would live our lives in any kind of more productive way. And the goal, therefore, building on Hegel, is to say, how would we reconstruct that line that, as Hegel notes correctly, does lead into Romanticism, and how could we go back, take that dialectic as it's developed in the Christian tradition, and work it out differently and, in the long run, much more productively. So as a very quick introduction, would you like to take on, or let's then, we'll follow the convention of turning, well, not pure romantics here, of opening up questions, and then we'll just play it by ear and then continue next week. So, questions and comments about either Romanticism in general or the three sets of readings. Please. Yes. The reason I use that odd tone of voice in answering is the answer is yes, but Hegel saw himself as taking a basic Christian development and developing it beyond the point that any Christian thinker had ever done before. So yes, in the sense that he is taking a basic dialectic out of Christianity and working it out, but no, in the sense that he does think his final summation goes far beyond. Just to give a very telling example of Hegel, which I think...
Far beyond or far again?
Yeah, indeed. Well, let me give an example of Hegel before I get to this, and it's very telling. So Hegel, from a very young age, of course, grew up in a society where everything he was taught in the educational system was, of course, exclusively in the Western tradition. Hegel, from a very young age, began carrying around notebooks, which sadly, by the way, have been lost, but they're described by numerous sources, in which every single concept he could come up with, he would then look at how that concept had played out in every philosophical and religious culture he had access to. Now, of course, he didn't have access to a lot, but still, given the world he grew up in, it's an amazing attempt. And the reason I mentioned that practice in answer to the question is he really saw the final summation he was trying to develop as one that would account for and give a proper place to, a lesser place by definition, within his grand system that he and he alone had finally completely synthesized. And so the way he would answer the question was Christianity would be a key for him, but a tradition, and he wanted to account for every single other tradition that had ever developed in the entire history of the world that would lead into his final summation.
So I'll give a different answer to your question. The question is, was Hegel a Christian? My answer is, Hegel believed he was a Christian. However, Hegel was a Christian heretic, as many Western philosophers have been. But the unpacking of that would demand another discussion, which will continue next week.
Please.
So these romantic heroes, for the most part, end up failing in their fight against structure. Then are these authors and poets suggesting that structure is more powerful than spirit?
Well, I would say structure is more enduring, right? Structure always endures, and therefore it's an endless battle against it. Yes, but the implication of and this is the key of what you're getting at, is absolutely the case. Spirit alone endures, but it cannot exist on this planet without structure, and so it is an endless battle.
So
yes.
So just to emphasize and develop that, so the romantic idea that Michael is alluding to now is this, that we can rebel against structure. And in this moment of rebellion, the empire of structure will be lifted and loosened, but structure will come back. And we know it will come back. So it's this heroic attempt to achieve the interlude of authenticity and true life. And thus, I claimed in an earlier exchange, it's a form of despair. What we think we can achieve true life only in these rebellious interludes, but we despair of changing the relation between structure and spirit in normal life. And we despair of it politically, but we despair of it also morally, as in this example of the relationship between romantic love and married life. The aim is to achieve the marriage, but the marriage turns out to be the return of the repetition. That's unimaginable and prohibited from entering the view of the romantic novel. And this despair continues so it has a longer history. So the history begins before in the mystical countercurrents within the Semitic monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's what the theologians call the via negativa. So true divinity exists in the negation, in the opposition. But it has no place in this world. Then there's romanticism. Authenticity is in these interludes in which we temporarily shake the structure. And the third moment is in 20th century existentialism and in philosophers like Sartre and in Heidegger. Shaking. But the shaking is in a sense doomed. So this is the view that we come to when we have no deeper understanding of our power to change the character of structure and its relation to spirit. And that's one of the points that then defines part of our agenda today in rethinking these ideas.
This is also, just a quick final point. This is also why one of the standard genres of the Romantic movement is tragedy, right? Because it's ultimately a tragic venture, the heroic, tragic figure standing against structure, and by definition, structure will always win, and therefore the excitement is that heroic standing against structure. But tragedy comes to be seen as the highest genre because, of course, by definition, from this point of view, it can't win. Next week, we will see if they're right.
Next week, we will begin with Romanticism, the first half of the class, and then go on to Christianity.
Great. See you next week.
Interesting way of proceeding.
Very, I think so too. And you're absolutely right. We'll schedule
Take our time.
Take our time, and yes. Happen to shift the weeks to week.
All parody of talks about like I've heard of it. Yeah. Are you coming to the Friday skill thing?